The air in the study of Ashford Park carried the sharp, biting scent of cedarwood and the cold finality of wet ink. It was a room designed for the administration of power, a space where ledger lines were drawn in black and white, and where lives were often reduced to mere footnotes in the pursuit of a larger, more profitable estate. Silas Thorne sat behind the massive mahogany desk, his posture as rigid as the laws he so skillfully manipulated. He did not look up as Clara Ashford entered. He continued to scrape his quill against the parchment, the sound like a small, persistent rodent gnawing at the foundations of her childhood. Clara did not speak first. She did not shift her weight. She stood with a spine as straight as a ledger's edge, her hands folded over the simple, worn fabric of her traveling cloak. She was 18, an age that should have promised the bloom of the season and the fluttering of dance cards. But in this room, she was merely an insolvency to be settled. The clock on the mantel ticked with a rhythmic, indifferent pulse, measuring the seconds of her remaining inheritance. Thorne finally set his quill aside, the movement deliberate and calculated to emphasize his dominance. He looked at her then, his eyes as cold and grey as a winter sea. He did not offer her a chair. He did not offer her a word of comfort regarding the father she had buried only 3 days prior. Instead, he reached into a small drawer and pulled out a stack of banknotes and a handful of coins, arranging them on the desk with the meticulous care of a man who counted every grain of sand in his hourglass. The £15 lay there, a small, pathetic mound of copper and paper against the dark, polished wood. It was an insult draped in the guise of charity. The £15 were not a gift. They were a ransom paid to clear a conscience that had long ago been bargained away. Thorne spoke then, his voice a low, gravelly drone that lacked any vibration of human warmth. He informed her that the entailment was absolute, that the debts of her late father had swallowed the marrow from the bones of the Ashford name, and that she was now a guest who had overstayed her welcome. He spoke of the charity of distant cousins and the dignity of the workhouse with the same detached, clinical tone. Clara heard the words, but she did not let them settle in her heart. She was busy performing a mental audit of the room. She noted the silver inkstand that had belonged to her grandfather, the way the light hit the dust motes dancing in the cold air, and the precise moment Thorne's hand twitched when he lied about the value of the family's timber holdings. She did not cry. She did not plead for the shelter of the roof she had been born under. She simply looked at the coins. To be homeless was to be invisible, and to be invisible was to be forgotten. Silas Thorne pushed the money toward her, his lip curling in a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. He told her she had 1 hour to gather what belonged to her, which, according to his inventory, amounted to very little beyond the clothes on her back and the memory of a name he was currently erasing. Clara stepped forward, her movements economical and poised. She picked up the coins, the cold metal biting into her palm. She did not thank him. She did not curse him. She simply turned and walked toward the door, her boots echoing on the marble floor with a sound like the ticking of a countdown. She understood the language of the house now. It was a language of ownership and theft, and she was no longer a part of its vocabulary. She spent her final hour not in mourning, but in calculation. She walked through the corridors of her home, her eyes recording the details she would need to remember: the grain of the oak panels, the specific weight of the front door's iron latch, and the way the wind whistled through the gaps in the attic windows. She was not a girl being cast out. She was an architect surveying the loss before the reconstruction began. When she finally stepped out onto the gravel drive, the winter wind tore at her cloak, but she did not flinch. She had £15 in her reticule and a lifetime of technical observations in her mind. She began the long walk toward the village, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the grey sky met the dark, jagged silhouette of the forest. She did not look back. The village of Oakhaven was a place of small minds and long memories, and by the time Clara arrived at the town square the following morning, her story had already been dissected and reimagined by every gossip at the well. They saw a girl of 18 with ink-stained fingers and a threadbare cloak, a tragedy walking in boots that had seen better days. They did not see the ledger she was building in her mind. The air in the square was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the restless energy of a crowd gathered for the quarterly land auction. Arthur Miller stood upon the raised wooden dais, his voice booming over the assembly as he rattled off the descriptions of livestock, farm implements, and parcels of exhausted soil. He was a man of business, his gavel a wooden judge that decided the fate of the local economy with every strike. Clara moved through the crowd like a shadow, ignored by the merchants and the farmers, who were busy bidding for futures they could not afford. She found a spot near the back, leaning against the cold stone of the apothecary's wall. She watched the proceedings with the detached eye of an auditor. She noted the desperation in the eyes of the bidders and the calculated indifference of the auctioneer. Then, Arthur reached for a heavy, salt-stained parchment that looked older than the village itself. A hush fell over the square, a silence so heavy it seemed to dampen the sound of the wind. This was the moment the town had been waiting for, the sale of Ashcomb Manor. It was a name that carried a weight of superstition, a place the locals called the Cursed Manor, not because of ghosts, but because of the relentless, crushing poverty it imposed upon anyone foolish enough to claim its deed. The manor had stood empty for 20 years, a stone carcass rotting in the valley, its roof a sieve and its fields a graveyard of thistle and bramble. Arthur began his pitch, though his heart was clearly not in it. He spoke of the vast acreage, the solid foundation, and the historical significance of the Ashford-adjacent territory. But the townspeople only saw the ruin. They knew the stories of the families who had been broken by its taxes and its draughty halls. They knew the curse was simply the high cost of maintenance and the low yield of its rocky soil. The starting bid was £10, a joke that no one laughed at. For a long minute, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the signs of the shops. The town square was a theatre of the cruel, and the silence was a weapon they used to mock the dead. Then a voice cut through the stillness, clear and level, devoid of the tremors of youth or the hesitation of the desperate. Clara Ashford stepped forward, her hand raised. She bid £15. The silence broke then, replaced by a wave of laughter that rippled through the crowd like a foul breeze. Silas Thorne, standing near the front with his associates, turned his head, a look of amused contempt crossing his features. He did not recognize the girl at first, and when he did, his laughter was the loudest of all. He called her a child, playing at being a lady, mocking the small pittance he had given her. The townspeople joined in, their sneers a reflection of their own fear of the ruin she was trying to buy. Arthur hesitated, his gavel hovering over the podium. He looked at Clara, his eyes searching for some sign of madness or a hidden joke. He asked her if she understood the terms, if she knew that the manor was a liability that would swallow her last coin before the sun set. Clara refused to glance at the crowd. She did not look at Silas Thorne. She looked directly at the auctioneer and repeated her bid with a mathematical certainty. She had seen the plans of the valley in her father's secret maps. She knew the drainage patterns that the farmers ignored, and she had noticed the specific type of limestone in the manor's foundation that suggested a quarry potential no one had explored. The £15 were not a gamble. They were a calculated investment in a structure everyone else was too blind to measure. The auctioneer's gavel fell like a guillotine. Sold for £15 to the girl in the threadbare cloak. The laughter intensified, a jagged sound of collective mockery. They thought they had witnessed a tragedy, the final act of the Ashford decline. They watched as Arthur handed her the iron key box, a rusted heavy container that looked like a relic from a sunken ship. It was a box of iron and decay, containing the keys to every room in the manor. Keys that had not turned in a lock for 2 decades. To the town, it was a box of junk. To Clara, it was the skeletal frame of her new sovereignty. She took the box, its weight pulling at her shoulder, but she did not stagger. She stood in the center of the square, a solitary figure, amidst the retreating crowd. She did not wait for the mockery to fade. She did not wait for a carriage that would never come. She turned toward the path that led away from the village and toward the crumbling stone gates of Ashcomb Manor. The walk was 3 miles of frozen mud and biting wind, a journey that stripped away the last remnants of her life as a daughter of the gentry. As she walked, she did not think of the cold or the hunger that began to gnaw at her. She thought of the keys. She thought of the locks they belonged to, and the secrets they had been designed to guard. She understood that a house is not just stone and wood. It is a ledger of the lives lived within it. And she was the first person in 20 years who knew how to audit the accounts. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long bruised shadows across the valley, the manor finally came into view. It was a jagged silhouette of grey stone against a greyer sky, a monument to neglect. The roof was missing slates like a mouth missing teeth, and the ivy clung to the walls like a suffocating shroud. The town was right about one thing. It was a ruin. But as Clara Ashford reached the front door and pulled the first heavy rusted iron key from her box, she did not see a disaster. She saw a foundation. She saw a structure that had been built to endure, a place that had waited for someone with the patience to listen to its stone heartbeat. She felt the cold metal of the key turn in the lock, a sound like a bone snapping back into place. The door groaned open, exhaling a breath of dust and ancient, trapped air. Clara stepped over the threshold, her spine straight, her eyes counting the shadows. She was no longer homeless. She was the architect of her own restoration. The entrance hall of Ashcomb Manor was not merely a room. It was a cold, cavernous throat that had swallowed 2 decades of silence. As Clara Ashford stepped further into the gloom, the air shifted, moving from the sharp, biting frost of the evening into a thick, stagnant atmosphere that tasted of pulverized stone and ancient beeswax. She stood perfectly still, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness and her senses to begin their first audit. The floor beneath her boots was made of flagstone, a heavy, unyielding grey that should have been polished to a silver sheen, but was now buried under a pelt of grey dust, so uniform it looked like velvet. She did not cough. She did not flinch. She simply counted. She counted the sallow light reflecting off the tarnished silver of the sconces, the 6 doors leading off the rotunda. The 12 steps visible before the grand staircase vanished into the darkness of the upper landing, and the 3 separate places where the ceiling plaster had succumbed to the weight of moisture, leaving jagged, white wounds in the ornate moulding. To the villagers of Oakhaven, this was a place of ghosts and financial ruin, a monument to a curse that claimed the sanity of its owners. To Clara, the curse was a matter of chemistry and physics, a combination of a leaking lead valley in the roof, a lack of ventilation, and the slow, inevitable oxidation of neglected metal. She raised her heavy iron receptacle, the rusted weight a grounding presence against her hip, and felt the specific chill of the stone leaching through the leather of her boots. This was the sensory reality of insolvency. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, mournful drip of water somewhere in the east wing, measuring the seconds of the house's decay like a water clock. She moved forward, her steps deliberate, choosing the center of each flagstone where the structural integrity was greatest. She was not a girl entering a haunted house. She was a surveyor assessing the bones of a kingdom. Before proceeding to the kitchens, she turned toward the library, the heavy oak doors groaning in protest as she forced them open. The room smelled of vanilla and decay, the scent of degrading paper and damp leather. This was the intellectual treasury of Ashcomb, and it was a shambles of neglect. Clara held her candle high, the light flickering over rows of spines that looked like rotting teeth. She did not mourn the lost knowledge. She calculated the salvage value. She noted the encroachment of mold on the lower shelves and the way the heavy velvet curtains had become a nursery for moths. However, the floor here was dry. The joists were solid. The roof leak had not yet penetrated this sanctuary. She touched the spine of a leather-bound volume, her ink-stained fingers tracing the gold leaf lettering. It was cold, but the leather had not yet succumbed to the red rot of high acidity. As her hand moved along the 3rd mahogany case in the northwest corner, her fingers stalled. She did not reach inside. She did not observe with her eyes. She looked with her sense of proportion. The shelf did not sit flush against the lath and plaster behind it. There was a gap, a shadow precisely 3/8 of an inch wider than the others. She leaned closer, her candle casting a long, diagnostic glow across the wood. The joinery here was too precise to be an accident of settling stone. It was a deliberate deviation. She pressed her thumb against a small, decorative rosette in the molding, feeling the click of a spring that had been maintained long after the house had been abandoned. The panel shifted, revealing a narrow, dark void behind the books. She did not reach inside. She did not allow curiosity to override her methodical nature. She simply noted the location in her mind, a hidden asset to be audited when she had secured the foundations of the house. It was a victory of preservation, a small, silent secret in her growing inventory of survival. The drawing room was a graveyard of furniture shrouded in linen. The sheets were no longer white but a jaundiced yellow, clinging to the shapes of chairs and tables like the winding cloths of forgotten giants. Clara reached out and touched the edge of a mahogany sideboard. The wood was cold, the grain choked with grit, yet beneath the grime she felt the solid, stubborn resistance of heartwood. It had not rotted, it had simply waited. She noted the way the light from her single tallow candle caught the glint of a tarnished sconce. The metal was bronze, not brass, a detail of quality that Silas Thorne would have missed in his haste to dismiss the property as a total loss. She felt no sense of being overwhelmed by the task ahead. She felt a strange, quiet expansion in her chest, a sense of rightness that only comes when a problem of immense complexity meets a mind capable of solving its variables. The manor was massive, a sprawling arrangement of late Georgian ambition and early Regency restraint. It possessed a geometry of neglect that Clara found almost beautiful in its honesty. Every crack in the wainscoting told a story of shifting foundations. Every water stain on the silk wallpaper was a map of a structural failure. She positioned herself amidst the hall and closed her eyes, visualizing the floor plans she had memorized from the county archives. She could feel the house stretching out around her, a skeletal network of joists and beams, lath and plaster, all of it under tension, all of it crying out for the stewardship of a steady hand. The dust was not dirt. It was the skin of a forgotten era, a layer of protection that had preserved the house even as it concealed its true value. She did not see the cobwebs that hung like tattered lace from the chandeliers. She saw the structural stability of the load-bearing walls and the precision of the joinery that had kept the doors from warping despite the damp. She moved toward the back of the house, where the air grew heavier with the scent of old soot and damp earth. This was the transition from the public face of the manor to its private, functional heart. The transition was marked by a change in the floor, from the grand flagstones of the hall to a narrower corridor of red brick, worn smooth by the passage of 1,000 ghost servants. The walls here were plain, stripped of the ostentatious moldings of the front rooms, revealing the raw, honest architecture of a house that had once known how to work. Clara felt a shift in the house's heartbeat here. It was faster, more urgent. She was moving toward the kitchens, the place where the heat of life had once been generated. She did not hurry. She maintained her rhythmic pace, her spine straight, her eyes recording every detail of the masonry. She was auditing the very foundations of her new life, and she would not permit a single flaw to go unrecorded. The kitchen of the ancient estate was a cathedral of cold iron and dead ash. It was a vast, subterranean space where the ceiling was supported by low, heavy arches of soot-stained stone, and the scent of a century of cooking had been compressed into a single, metallic tang of verdigris and grease. Clara stood at the threshold, her candle flickering in the sudden, sharp draft that whistled through the servants' entrance. The room was dominated by a massive cast-iron range, a multi-oven beast that sat in the hearth like a hibernating engine. It was rusted, the dampers seized by decades of inactivity, but it was solid. It was the heart of the house, and it was currently cold. She set her corroded metal case on the central preparation table, a thick slab of sycamore that had been scrubbed so many times in its history that the wood was concave in the center, a physical record of 1,000,000 hours of labor. She began her inventory with the methodical precision of a quartermaster. She was not searching for gold or silver. She looked for utility. She counted the copper pots hanging from the ceiling racks, their surfaces clouded by a thick, green skin of oxidation. She noted the state of the bread ovens, the condition of the lystone, and the structural integrity of the shelving. The kitchen was a mess of broken glass and bird droppings, but the infrastructure remained intact. The copper was heavy, high-quality metal that could be restored with salt and vinegar. The iron was thick enough to withstand another century of fires, once the rust was scoured away. This was the technical reality of restoration. It was not a matter of magic or luck, but of friction and time. She did not despair at the grime. She calculated the amount of soft soap and elbow grease required to make the copper shine again. As she moved toward the walk-in pantry, her candle throwing long, skeletal shadows against the lime-washed walls, Clara noticed something that did not fit the logic of a 20-year vacancy. The floor of the pantry was clear of the thick dust that carpeted the rest of the kitchen. A narrow path had been worn into the stone, leading toward the furthest, darkest corner of the room. She stopped, her hand tightening around the base of the candlestick. She did not call out, she did not retreat. She stood perfectly still, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, listening to the silence of the pantry. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the vibrating, held silence of a living presence. She turned her head slowly, as her eyes scanning the shadows behind the towering shelves of empty preserve jars. A figure was huddled on a low stool in the corner, a woman so thin and grey she seemed to have been woven from the cobwebs themselves. She was dressed in a gown of faded bombazine that might have been black 20 years ago, but was now the colour of a winter sky. Her hair was a wild, snowy halo, and her eyes, when they finally met Clara's, were as sharp and suspicious as a cornered cat's. This was Martha Halloway, the woman the village said had vanished into the walls of the manor, the last remaining servant who had refused to leave when the money ran out. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply sat there, a human ghost in a stone tomb, her hands folded over a small, dented copper bowl. The bowl was not a vessel, it was a kingdom of survival. Inside were a few shriveled apples and a handful of dry oats, the meager inventory of a life lived on the edge of extinction. Clara looked at the woman, and then at the bowl, and then back to the woman's eyes. She did not offer a word of pity. She did not scream in surprise. She understood the language of Martha's presence. It was the language of steadfastness, the stubborn refusal to be evicted from the only world she knew. Clara stepped forward, not with the predatory grace of a new owner, but with the measured respect of a fellow auditor. She reached into her reticule and pulled out one of the small loaves of bread she had purchased in Oakhaven, setting it on the sycamore table without a word. It was a gesture of administrative recognition, an entry in the new record of the house. Martha spoke then, her voice a dry, rasping sound like parchment being torn. She asked Clara if she was another one come to steal the lead from the pipes or the glass from the windows. She spoke of the men who had come before, the scavengers who had picked at the house's carcass, and the way the manor had fought them off with its cold and its rot. Martha provided the inventory of the house's failures with a grim, almost prideful satisfaction. She told Clara that the range was blocked, that the chimney was a city of jackdaws, and that the cellar was currently 3 feet deep in brackish rainwater that smelled of the very earth itself. Clara took a small notebook from her cloak and began to write. She did not interrupt the woman. She recorded every detail: the jackdaws in the flue, the flooded cellar, the seized dampers. Each failure was a line in her new stewardship record, a problem to be solved through logic and labor. She was not overwhelmed by the list of disasters. She was energized by the clarity of the task. The manor was not a cursed ruin. It was a massive, neglected machine. And she had just found the first person who knew where the gears were jammed. She looked at Martha and informed her that they would start with the range. To have heat was to have the ability to transform the cold. To have the range was to have the heart of the house beating again. It was a matter of action, not of hope. The two women stood in the cold, cavernous kitchen, the young architect and the ancient ghost, bound together by the sudden, sharp reality of a shared purpose. Martha Halloway did not smile, and Clara Ashford did not offer a hand in friendship. Instead, they both looked toward the massive iron range, seeing it not as a rusted relic, but as the first objective in a long, methodical war of restoration. The ticking of the clock in the hall was no longer a countdown to homelessness. It was the rhythmic pulse of a new beginning. Clara felt the weight of the stout lockbox on the table, a solid, heavy anchor in a world of dust. She was no longer a girl with 15 pounds and a threadbare cloak. She was the lady of Ashcomb Manor, and her first entry in her personal ledger was a promise of fire. The first light of the following morning was not a golden promise. It was a thin, grey sliver of reality that cut through the library's tall, arched windows, illuminating the scale of the labour Clara Ashford had inherited. The frost had etched intricate, fern-like patterns across the glass, a fragile lace of ice that obscured the desolate valley beyond. Clara remained situated in the middle of the room, her spine as unyielding as the oak shelves that surrounded her. She remained oblivious to the biting chill that seeped through the floorboards. Nor did she acknowledge the hollow ache of hunger in her stomach. She was busy performing a mental audit of the library's geometry. She noted the way the dust had settled in thick, undisturbed drifts on the uppermost moldings, the precise angle of the shadow cast by the heavy mahogany globe, and the rhythmic, hollow sound of the wind rattling the chimney flue. To the villagers of Oakhaven, this room was a graveyard of dead ideas and cursed history. To Clara, it was a tactical headquarters awaiting its first commanding officer. Martha Halloway appeared in the doorway, a shadow among shadows, her presence heralded by the soft, dry rasp of her bombazine skirts against the floor. She carried a bucket of warm water and a small, cracked bowl containing a greyish paste of linseed oil and beeswax. The servant did not speak. She did not offer a morning greeting. She simply watched the young mistress of the house, with eyes that had seen 40 years of winters and a dozen failed attempts at restoration. Clara looked at the bucket, then at the woman's gnarled, ink-stained fingers. She understood the unspoken challenge. Martha was the memory of the house, a living ledger of its decline, and she was waiting to see if Clara was a builder or merely a scavenger. The cleaning of the library was not a domestic chore. It was a meticulous extraction of order from chaos. Clara took a soft, lint-free cloth and dipped it into the oil, her movements deliberate and economical. She began with the lower shelves of the south wall, where the dampness from the floor was most prevalent. She did not scrub. She did not use force. She applied the oil in slow, circular motions, watching as the mahogany drank the moisture, its deep, hidden grain beginning to glow like a slow-burning ember. She worked with the precision of a clockmaker, moving from the left stiles to the right rails, ensuring that no joint or molding went uninspected. The dust was not dirt. It was the skin of a forgotten era, and as Clara peeled it away, she felt the house begin to breathe again. The taxonomy of the shelves revealed the minds of the men who had built Ashcomb Manor. There were treatises on Roman architecture, volumes on drainage and irrigation, and leather-bound accounts of the valley's ancient quarries. As Clara handled each book, her fingers recorded the state of the bindings. She noted the flexibility of the calfskin, the acidity of the glue, and the specific way the gold leaf had tarnished in the damp air. She was not reading the words. She was auditing the stewardship of the collection. She did not allow herself to be distracted by the poetry or the histories. She was looking for the structural logic of the room, the hidden patterns that would tell her where the house's secrets were buried. Martha finally moved, setting her bucket down with a heavy metallic thud. She began to clean the floor, her movements a rhythmic, agonizing slow motion of labor. As she worked, she spoke, her voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from the stones themselves. She spoke of the Ashford men who had once sat in these chairs, the scholars who had mapped the stars and the drunkards who had gambled away the timber rights. She provided a verbal inventory of the family's decline, listing the items that had been sold us off one by one. The silver inkstands, the portrait of the third Earl, the first edition maps of the West Indies. Each name was a debt, and each debt was a stain on the ledger. Clara was rebuilding in her mind. Clara did not interrupt the woman. She recorded the information, filing it away alongside her observations of the wood grain and the ceiling plaster. She understood that Martha was the only person who knew the true cost of the house's insolvency. The servant told her of the night the last master had died, how the lawyers had descended like crows to pick at the remains, and how Silas Thorne had been the loudest crow of all. Martha described how Thorne had spent 3 days in this very library, tearing through desks and cabinets, searching for something he never found. Clara's hand paused on a spine of weathered vellum. She avoided glancing at Martha, but her internal focus shifted. Silas Thorne's greed was a variable she could calculate, and his failure to find what he sought was a flaw in his logic that she intended to exploit. By midday, the northwest corner of the library began to catch the shifting light. This was the area Clara had identified during her initial audit, the place where the joinery deviated by a precise 3/8 of an inch. She approached the third mahogany case, her movements slowing, her spine straightening even further. She did not reach for the rosette immediately. She stood and looked at the shelf, measuring the gap with her eyes, confirming the mathematical certainty of the hidden space. The dust here was thinner, as if the air itself had been kept under tension. Martha stopped her scrubbing, the silence of the room becoming a heavy vibrating presence. The rosette was not a decoration. It was a trigger, a mechanical key to a door that had not been opened in a generation. Clara placed her thumb against the center of the carved rose, feeling the cold, stubborn resistance of the iron spring behind the wood. She applied a steady, calculated pressure. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The house seemed to hold its breath, the ticking of the clock in the hall stalling in anticipation. Then there was a sound, a low, metallic click that echoed through the empty shelves like a bone snapping back into place. The entire section of the bookcase shifted, moving inward by an inch, revealing a hairline fracture in the wood that smelled of ancient, trapped air. Clara did not hesitate. She did not allow the flutter of excitement to disrupt her rhythmic control. She pulled the panel toward her, the hinges groaning with the protest of 20 years of rust. Behind the books lay a narrow, dark void, a secret chamber no larger than a confession booth. The air inside was dry, preserved by the thickness of the mahogany and the lack of ventilation. Clara raised her candle, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the small, unvarnished desk within. It was empty. The legendary Blackwood ledger, the iron-bound record of the valley's true history, was not here. She did not gasp. She did not let out a cry of frustration. Instead, she knelt to examine the dust on the surface of the desk. There was a rectangular impression in the fine grey silt, a ghost of an object that had rested there for decades. The impression was crisp on 3 sides, but the 4th side was blurred, as if the object had been removed with great haste. Beside the void lay a single, yellowed scrap of vellum, caught in the crevice of the desk's hinge. Clara retrieved it, her fingers steady. It was not a deed, but a hand-drawn schematic of the manor's foundations marked with a series of cryptic notations in her father's elegant script. "He didn't find it," Clara whispered, her voice level. She looked at Martha, who was staring at the empty space with a mixture of terror and confusion. Silas Thorne searched this room, but he was looking for a book. He was not looking for the architecture of the truth. The map was not a treasure, it was a set of coordinates. It proved that the Blackwood ledger existed, but it also suggested that the manor's secrets were buried deeper than a library shelf. Silas Thorne's failure to find the ledger was his greatest vulnerability, a missing variable in his quest for total dominance. Clara folded the vellum and tucked it into her bodice, feeling the paper sharp against her skin. The discovery was a small win, a confirmation of her logic, but it did not provide the heat they needed to survive the night. She looked at the frost on the windows, then at Martha's shivering frame. The library, for all its potential, was a tomb without fire, a matter of survival, not of sentiment. Clara turned away from the secret compartment, her mind already shifting to the next tactical objective. "The library can wait for the light of month 3, she said, her voice echoing with a new, authoritative clarity. "We cannot audit the past while we are freezing in the present. We go to the kitchen." The journey from the library to the kitchen was a passage through a kingdom of ice. Every footfall on the stone flags of the corridor sounded like a crack of a whip in the silence. When they reached the cavernous kitchen, the air was even colder, smelling of damp soot and cold iron. The cast-iron range stood against the far wall, a blackened titan of Victorian engineering that had once fed 50 people, but now sat silent and choked with ash. It was the heart of Ashcomb Manor, and it was currently dead. Clara did not ask for help. She knelt before the range, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. She took a small iron scraper from her toolkit and began to clear the primary grate. The sound of metal on metal was harsh, a rhythmic scratching that measured the ticking of the clock. She worked with the same precision she had applied to the library shelves, removing the clinkers and the solidified ash that had blocked the airflow for years. Her fingers were soon stained black, the grime embedding itself under her nails. But she did not flinch. "The range is not a stove," she murmured, more to herself than to Martha. "It is a machine of heat and circulation. If the flues are blocked, the house remains a corpse." She reached deep into the soot-stained throat of the chimney, feeling for the damper. It was rusted shut, a stubborn iron plate that refused to move. Clara did not use brute force. She took a small vial of whale oil from her reticule and applied a few drops to the hinges, her touch light and analytical. She waited, counting the seconds in her head, allowing the oil to penetrate the corrosion. Then, with a single sharp jerk of the handle, the damper gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Martha watched from the shadows, her eyes wide as she saw the young woman disassemble the internal plates of the range. She saw Clara check the water jacket for cracks and clear the soot doors with a wire brush. This was not the work of a lady. It was the labor of a mechanic, a silent, private art of survival that sought to reclaim the fundamental elements of life. By the time the shadows began to lengthen across the kitchen floor, the range was no longer a rusted relic. It was a cleaned, primed engine of warmth. Clara stood, wiping her hands on a coarse rag. Her face was smudged with soot, and her spine remained perfectly straight. She looked at the range, then at the small pile of dry kindling she had salvaged from the library's broken crates. She experienced none of the triumph of a conqueror. She felt the quiet, expansive peace of a logic that had restored a function. The restoration of the range was the first entry in her new ledger of deeds. As she prepared to strike the first match, she knew that the heat would do more than warm their bones. It would signal to the town of Oakhaven that the lady of Ashcomb Manor was no longer a ghost, but a master of her own hearth. The fire would be the first sign of a public reckoning that was yet to come. The library of the grand residence was not a collection of literature. It was a vault of architectural intent. Before the fire in the kitchen had even begun to chase the damp from the floorboards, Clara Ashford stood before the central, mahogany shelving unit in the east wing, her fingers tracing the erratic grain of the rosewood inlay. She did not see the dust as a sign of neglect. She saw it as a veil over a mathematical certainty. By the standards of Georgian joinery, the left pilaster was exactly 3/8 of an inch wider than the right. It was a discrepancy that bothered her internal sense of order, a flaw that suggested a hidden purpose. She measured the gap with the span of her ink-stained fingers, her mind performing a rapid-fire audit of the room's symmetry. The carved floral ornament was not a mere decoration. It was a mechanical trigger. It sat at the center of the cornice, a hand-carved blossom of darkened oak that appeared fused to the wood. Clara pressed her thumb against the petals, feeling the cold, silent resistance of a spring that had not moved in 20 years. She did not shove. She did not force. She applied a steady, calculated pressure to the third petal on the left, mimicking the rhythm of a clock's escapement. There was a faint, metallic click followed by the dry groan of gears engaging behind the plaster. A narrow section of the shelving slid back with a whisper of shifting stone, revealing a hollow void. Inside lay a yellowed scrap of vellum, curled like a dried leaf. It was the foundation schematic, a map of secrets that Silas Thorne had failed to find, because he lacked the patience for precision. The fire in the kitchen did not merely consume wood. It consumed the silence that had reigned over Ashcombe for 2 decades. It was a low, rhythmic roar, a living presence that breathed warmth into the damp stones and threw long, amber shadows across the sycamore table where Clara now sat. The schematic was a set of instructions, a mathematical argument for the house's survival. It detailed the structural intersections of the wings, marking a point beneath the floorboards of the study where the foundation stones met the bedrock. Clara studied the notations, her spine remaining perfectly straight. She sought the Blackwood ledger, the only record capable of balancing the debt Thorne had imposed upon her name. A shadow fell across the threshold of the kitchen, preceded by the scent of damp wool and the cold, sharp air of the valley. Clara did not jump. She did not reach for a weapon. She slowly turned her head as Lord Julian Vane stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the encroaching twilight. He was a man defined by a quiet, observant weariness, his grey eyes carrying the weight of a world he found devoid of integrity. He looked at the fire, taking in the roaring blaze of the cast-iron range, then at the soot on Clara's face, and finally at the heavy iron chest that sat like a silent sentry beside her. He did not offer a polite greeting. He noted that the town of Oakhaven was talking about the smoke rising from the cursed chimneys. He observed that many believed she was either a ghost or a fool. Yet he had seen the way she handled the deeds at the auction, and he suspected she was neither. Clara stood, her movements economical and poised. She did not invite him to sit, nor did she offer him the meager warmth of her hearth. Instead, she laid the vellum map on the table, the parchment crinkling under her fingers. She understood that Julian was not an enemy to be feared, but a witness to be audited. She informed him that the house was not cursed, merely mismanaged, and that the previous masters had left a trail that Silas Thorne was too arrogant to follow. Julian stepped into the warmth, his eyes scanning the schematic with clinical precision. He pointed to a specific notation near the study's hearth, a mark that indicated a secondary vault not included in the modern surveys. The audit that followed was an intellectual partnership born of necessity. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the dry, rhythmic scratching of pens. Julian had brought a copy of the county's land registry, a document Thorne believed he had scrubbed of any Ashford claims. Julian unfurled the fibrous parchment across the sycamore table. The paper smelled of damp cellars and oxidized ink. Clara ran her calloused fingertips over the heavy grain of the registry, feeling the physical indentations where the surveyor's heavy nib had pressed into the sheet. Together, they performed a line-by-line inventory of the property's history. It was a rigorous mathematical unraveling. Clara translated the archaic measurements, poles, perches, and chains, into strict acreage, aligning them with the foundation schematic she had pulled from the library's hidden compartment. She compared the texture of the paper and the specific phrasing of the easements across 3 decades of records. Clara's mind worked with the speed of a counting house, tracking the geometric boundaries of the valley against the shifting language of the deeds. She identified the exact moment the legal terminology shifted from the honorable bounds of stewardship to a surreptitious right of absolute transfer. Thorne had masked his theft through a gradual obfuscation of property lines, rounding down the acreage over successive tax filings. She did not weep for the lost acres. She calculated the interest Thorne had accrued on his lies. As the candle flickered low, drowning its wick in a pool of hot tallow, Julian's finger stalled over a clause in a 1792 deed. He did not speak immediately. He leaned closer, the amber light catching the analytical lines of his face. He had found the lost deed of the northern allotment. It proved the entire northern section of the estate. The portion Thorne had used as collateral for his private ventures was a private holding granted to Clara's grandmother in her own name. Its inheritance was absolute. To Silas Thorne, this acreage was a weapon of financial dominance. To Clara, it was the evidence that would bankrupt his claims. Julian looked at her then, a flicker of profound respect breaking through his stoic exterior. He told her that she held the leash to Thorne's ruin, but that they still needed the Blackwood ledger to prove the forgery of the main estate's transfer. They moved to the study, guided by the schematic's cryptic measurements. The air in the study was stale, tasting of dry rot and abandoned ambitions. Julian assisted her in prying back a false floorboard near the hearth, revealing a small iron-lined cavity. Clara reached inside, her heart steady, expecting the heavy weight of the Blackwood ledger. Her hand met only cold, empty air. The vault was vacant. A rectangular patch of undisturbed dust on the iron floor indicated where a massive volume had once rested, its absence as loud as a scream. Clara withdrew her hand, her expression remaining a mask of granite. The Blackwood ledger was not a lost relic, it was a stolen hostage. She did not need to ask who had taken it. Silas Thorne had known of the vault's existence. Even if he hadn't known how to trigger the library's hidden mechanism, he had the ledger, and with it he held the only proof of his own crimes. Julian left as silently as he had arrived, a shadow returning to the night, leaving Clara with a victory that felt like a challenge. Once the heavy oak door closed behind him, the suffocating silence of the manor returned, pressing against the stone walls. Clara did not seek her bedchamber. She remained in the kitchen, sitting perfectly still before the cast-iron range. The fire had burned down to glowing amber coals. She listened to the methodical ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hall, a rhythmic pulse that measured the passing seconds. As the cast-iron cooled, it let out a series of sharp, metallic clicks, a staccato language of contracting metal that mirrored the calculations running through her mind. She counted the hours until dawn. She counted the days she had left before Thorne would return to enforce his false claim. She counted the exact number of steps it would take to rebuild her fortress before the final reckoning. She did not allow the despair of the empty vault to settle in her chest. The Blackwood ledger was gone, but the foundation of the house, and the truth it held, remained firmly beneath her feet. Morning brought the first day of her restoration labor, a period measured not by weeks, but by the weight of the slates and the ring of the hammer. The restoration was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a sensory war against decay. Clara did not fear the height of the gables. She did not tremble as the bitter winter wind tore at her threadbare shawl. She climbed the scaffolding she had built from salvaged library crates and rusted iron piping, her boots finding purchase on the slick, frost-covered stone ledges. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. The freezing air bit into the exposed skin of her knuckles, and the rough splinters of the wooden planks tore at her skirts, but her spine remained perfectly. The roof required a meticulous eye for the geometry of water. Clara spent the first week on the high gables, replacing the missing Westmoreland slates with a rhythmic precision that mimicked the ticking of a clock. She worked with a heavy oak bucket of mortar, mixing the compound herself in the courtyard below, before hauling it up the perilous scaffolding. The process was a tactile battle. She blended slaked lime with coarse river sand, and a binder of horsehair scavenged from the stables. Her hands, caked in the caustic white lime, moved over the cold stone to seal the eaves where the rain had wept into the house's heart for 20 years. Every slate was a calculated weight. Every copper nail, driven through the slate with a heavy iron hammer, was a commitment to permanence. She learned the grammar of lead flashing, shaping the thick, pliable metal around the chimney stacks to redirect the heavy rains. Below her, the gardens lay in a grey slumber. But above, the manor was regaining its crown. The work was an unspoken, solitary method of enduring. Clara's hands, once soft and ink-stained, became hard and calloused, the skin etched with the grit of pulverized stone and the dark stains of weathered lead. She did not complain. She did not allow Martha Halloway to see her exhaustion. Every evening, they returned to the kitchen, their spines straight despite the ache in their limbs. Martha had transformed from a ghost into a quartermaster. The servant managed the meager supplies with a fierce competence, measuring the tallow candles as if they were gold bullion. They did not speak of the town's mockery. Instead, they discussed the curing time of the mortar, the draught of the chimney flues, and the precise ratio of lye needed to scrub the marble floors. By the end of the first week, the house had begun to change. The grand hall no longer groaned under the weight of a step, and the cast-iron range was a steady, dependable presence, a beating heart of heat in the frozen stone. Clara stood in the center of the rotunda, her eyes counting the restored moldings. The house was no longer a stone carcass. It was becoming a fortress of truth. She touched the sturdy lockbox, the metal now polished and smooth from use. The town of Oakhaven was growing restless. They had seen the repairs, and they knew that the girl in the threadbare cloak was no longer a tragedy. Silas Thorne would hear of the smoke and the hammers, and he would know that the audit had begun. Clara looked at the empty place on the table where the ledger should have been. She did not feel fear. She felt the expansive, quiet satisfaction of a logic that was finally being weaponized. The ledger of their lives was coming into balance, and she would walk through fire to write the final entry. She recorded the week's victories not on paper, but in the faultless memory of her own mind. It was a mental ledger of survival, meticulously balanced against the debts of her past. She noted one vital thing restored: the kitchen hearth and the structural integrity of the east gable roof, which now shielded them from the biting frost. She counted one ally gained. Lord Julian Vane, earned not through polite smiles, but through the shared, uncompromising grammar of evidence. Most importantly, she logged one enemy placed under strict mathematical observation: Silas Thorne, the arrogant thief of the Blackwood Ledger, who did not yet realize that he had stolen a simple book only to lose an entire kingdom. The morning air of the 9th week tasted of iron and impending snow, a sharp, metallic draught that whistled through the newly sealed eaves of Ashcomb Manor. Clara Ashford waited squarely in the middle of the entrance hall. Her boots planted firmly on the flagstones, she had spent 3 days scrubbing with lye and pumice. The stone was no longer buried under a velvet pelt of dust. It was a cold, grey mirror, reflecting the flickering amber light of the hearth. She did not move as the sound of heavy carriage wheels crunched against the frost-shattered gravel of the drive. She did not flinch as the rhythmic thud of a heavy brass knocker echoed through the rotunda. like a gavel strike against the heart of the house. She simply counted the shadows of the men as they darkened the frosted glass of the front door, performing a rapid-fire audit of their intent. Arthur Miller stood at the threshold, his breath blooming in the frigid air like white plumes of surrender. Behind him, 3 members of the Oakhaven Town Council huddled in their heavy wool overcoats, their faces set in expressions of practiced, bureaucratic solemnity. They looked like a row of ravens perched on a fence, waiting for the carrion of a failed ambition. Arthur did not meet her eyes immediately. He looked instead at the polished grain of the door and the structural stability of the porch. He held a thick official parchment in his gloved hand, the red wax seal glowing like a fresh wound against the pale paper. To the village, this was an eviction notice, a legal finality meant to erase an embarrassment. To Clara, it was a variable in an equation she had already solved. The document Arthur presented was not a letter. It was a weapon of social hygiene, citing 6 separate violations of public safety and structural insolvency. He spoke in a low, level drone, his voice lacking the predatory edge of Silas Thorne but carrying the heavy, indifferent weight of a consensus. He informed her that the council had deemed the manor a hazard to the valley, a crumbling carcass that threatened the safety of any passerby. He spoke of the curse as if it were a matter of municipal code, a debt of neglect that could only be settled by the immediate vacation of the premises. Clara took the paper, her fingers calloused by weeks of masonry and leadwork, steady against the crisp vellum. She did not study the seal. She looked at the men, her mind recording the precise flicker of guilt in Arthur's gaze. She did not invite them into the warmth of the hall. She stood on the threshold, a solitary figure in a gown of mended wool, her spine as unyielding as the load-bearing pillars behind her. She did not plead for more time, nor did she speak of the cold that would claim her if she were cast out once more. Instead, she asked for the specific measurements upon which their assessment of insolvency was based. She inquired about the load-bearing capacity of the east gable roof she had just restored and the drainage ratio of the cellar she had drained of its brackish poison. The councilmen shifted their weight, their eyes darting to the freshly pointed mortar between the stones. They had expected a girl broken by the house's decay. They found an architect who spoke the grammar of their own laws. Arthur Miller hesitated, the paper in Clara's hand suddenly appearing less like a decree and more like a flawed ledger entry. He noted the way the smoke rose in a straight, confident line from the chimneys and the lack of a groan from the staircase as the wind shifted. He observed that the ruin was no longer acting like a corpse. However, the council's instructions were absolute, and the influence of Thorne was an invisible, suffocating pressure on their necks. He told her that she had 48 hours to clear the estate before the sheriff would be sent to bolt the doors. Clara did not argue. She did not curse the unfairness of a system that protected the thief and punished the steward. She simply nodded once, a gesture of administrative finality, and closed the heavy oak door, the sound echoing through the manor like the ticking of a countdown. The silence that followed was not a heavy weight, it was a space for calculation. Clara turned toward the library, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. She did not seek comfort from Martha Halloway, who stood in the shadows of the kitchen corridor. Her hands trembling as she clutched a damp rag, she went to her desk, the weathered strongbox sitting beside her like a silent advisor. She opened the land registry Julian Vane had provided, her eyes scanning the fine, fibrous texture of the parchment. She was not looking for mercy, she was looking for a technicality. Every law had a seam, and every debt had a hidden credit. She began to write, her quill scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, decisive pulse that measured the dwindling hours of her sovereignty. The following afternoon, the silence of the valley was shattered by a far more ostentatious arrival. A carriage of dark, polished ebony, pulled by 4 matched greys, surged up the drive with the violent arrogance of a predator returning to a kill site. Silas Thorne stepped out before the horses had even settled, his presence a dark stain against the pristine white of the morning frost. He was dressed in a coat of fine superfine wool, a silk cravat tied with the meticulous complexity of a man who had never known the grit of lime mortar. He carried a silver-topped cane, the metal glinting in the pale sun like a cold, artificial eye. The silver cane was not a walking aid. It was a scepter of stolen authority, a physical manifestation of the wealth he had carved from the bones of Clara's inheritance. Thorne did not knock. He pushed the door open, the hinges gliding with a silence that spoke of Clara's recent lubrication. He entered the hall as if he already owned the air within it, his nostrils flaring at the scent of fresh beeswax and wood smoke. He looked at the polished floor, then at the repaired moldings, his lip curling in a sneer that combined amusement with an insidious, creeping greed. He did not see the beauty of the restoration. He saw the increased valuation of the asset. He saw the girl standing at the end of the hall, her hands hidden in the folds of her apron, her face a mask of granite. He did not see a niece or a ward. He saw a nuisance that had somehow managed to polish a discarded stone. He began to speak before the door had even clicked shut, his voice a rich, oily baritone that filled the rotunda with a scent of expensive tobacco and condescension. He mocked the child's play of her repairs, calling the restoration a pathetic attempt to wallpaper a tomb. He informed her that the council's notice was merely the formality he had facilitated to spare her the indignity of a winter spent in a pile of rubble. He offered her a charitable sum of £50 to leave quietly, a pittance that would allow her to find a room in a distant city where the Ashford name was not a source of laughter. He spoke of the house's curse as if he were the only one who could afford to lift it, his eyes lingering on the heavy mahogany of the banister. Clara did not interrupt his performance. She did not flinch when he struck the floor with his silver cane to emphasize his dominance. She stood with her spine perfectly straight, her eyes recording the specific way his left hand twitched toward his pocket when he mentioned the legality of the deeds. She waited until the echoes of his voice had died away, leaving only the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the library. Then she spoke, her voice level and devoid of the tremors of youth. She did not discuss the cold or the charity he offered. She spoke of the northern allotment. She spoke of the 1792 deed that Thorne believed was buried beneath the dust of Oakhaven's forgotten records. She mentioned the absolute inheritance of her grandmother, a holding that sat like an island of sovereignty in the middle of the estate he had stolen. The change in Silas Thorne was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a slow, toxic contraction of his features. The color drained from his face, leaving it the jaundiced yellow of old parchment. He did not laugh. He did not mock her further. He tightened his grip on the silver cane until his knuckles as white as the lime on Clara's hands. He asked her, in a voice that had lost its oily sheen, what she thought a scrap of paper could do against the weight of his influence. He reminded her that the Blackwood ledger was in his possession, and without its iron-bound evidence of the main estate's transfer, her little allotment was merely a grave in a field of his own. He took a step forward, the cold grey of his eyes hardening into a predatory stare. Clara did not retreat. She did not let the fear of his stolen ledger show in the set of her shoulders. She looked directly at the man who had cast her out with £15 and informed him that a house was not just stone and wood. It was a record of every hand that had touched it. She hinted at the foundation schematic she had found, at the crypts and vaults that the Ashford men had built to protect their legacy from men exactly like him. She spoke of the legal audit she and Julian Vane had performed, a mathematical unraveling of his tax filings that proved his rounding off of the acreage was a felony, not an oversight. She did not need the ledger to prove he was a thief. She only needed the ledger to prove the scale of his theft. The air in the hall grew thick with the unspoken tension of a reckoning. Thorne looked around the room, and, for the first time, he seemed to notice the precision of the work Clara had done. He saw that she had not just cleaned the house. She had audited it. She knew the location of every joist, every seam, and every secret. He realized that the Cursed Manor was no longer a liability he could use to bury her. It was a fortress she had built around herself. He raised his cane, his arm trembling with a suppressed, violent energy, but he did not strike. He understood the language of the house now. It was a language of meticulous survival, and Clara Ashford was its only fluent speaker. He turned without a word, his boots echoing on the flagstones with a sound like a retreating army. He did not offer the £50 again. He did not look back at the girl who had transformed an insult into a kingdom. As he stepped out into the biting winter air, the heavy oak door did not slam behind him. It was closed with a rhythmic, decisive click by the woman who now held the keys to its future. Clara stood in the sudden, expansive silence of the hall, her hand resting on the restored lockbox. The reckoning was not over. It had only just moved to the public square. She looked at the kitchen hearth, where the fire continued to roar, a beating heart of heat in the frozen stone. The ledger of their lives was finally in balance, and she was ready to sign the final page in the light of the following day. She spent the remainder of the evening not in celebration, but in preparation. She and Martha Halloway sat at the sycamore table, the yellow light of a single candle illuminating the documents they had gathered. They did not speak of Thorne's threats or the council's notice. They spoke of the transport of the evidence to the town square and the specific sequence of the presentation. Clara noted the allies they had gained and the variables that remained under observation. She did not feel the exhaustion of the day's conflict. She felt the quiet, ordered peace of a mind that had accounted for every risk. The restoration of the vast property was nearly complete, and as the grandfather clock struck midnight, the sound was no longer a countdown. It was a herald of the truth that would shock the town of Oakhaven at dawn. The dawn over Oakhaven was a cold, clinical grey, the sun a pale, distant coin that refused to offer any warmth to the frozen streets. Clara Ashford stood in the centre of the town square, her posture as rigid as the iron railings of the apothecary's shop. She did not wear the silk and lace of her former life at Ashford Park, but the simple, mended wool of a working woman. Her hands, calloused and stained with the honest grit of lime and soot, were folded over the handle of the ancient key chest. Beside her stood Martha Halloway, the ancient servant appearing less like a ghost and more like a sentinel, her spine mirroring the straightness of her mistress's. They did not speak. They did not pace. They stood with the quiet, terrifying patience of those who have already accounted for every variable. The town square was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the restless, nervous energy of a crowd that sensed a shift in the valley's gravity. Arthur Miller stood upon the raised wooden dais, the eviction notice trembling slightly in his hand. He looked at the gathered councilmen and then at the girl who had bought a ruin for £15. He did not see the tragedy he had witnessed 9 weeks prior. He saw a sovereign entity. The townspeople, who had once laughed at the girl in the threadbare cloak, now stood in a heavy, expectant silence. They had seen the smoke from Ashcomb's chimneys. They had heard the rhythmic ring of the hammer. They knew the curtains was breaking, and they were eager to see who would be crushed beneath its final weight. The arrival of Silas Thorne was heralded by the aggressive clatter of his carriage and the sharp, rhythmic strike of his silver-topped cane against the cobblestones. He moved through the crowd like a dark tide, his face a mask of predatory arrogance. He ignored the villagers. He looked at Clara, his eyes burning with the frantic, toxic greed of a man whose house of cards was beginning to catch the wind. He carried a heavy, leather-bound volume under his arm, the Blackwood Ledger, gripping it as if it were a shield rather than a book. To the town, it was the record of his authority. To Clara, it was the final entry in a ledger she had already balanced. Thorne did not wait for the council to speak. He stepped onto the dais, his voice a booming, oily command that sought to reclaim the air. He called for the immediate execution of the eviction, citing the safety of the valley and the insolvency of the Ashford line. He spoke of the Cursed Manor with a feigned pity, his hand tightening on the ledger. He informed the crowd that he held the only true record of the estate's transfer, the iron-bound proof that Clara Ashford was a squatter in a tomb that belonged to him. He struck the podium with his silver cane, the sound a sharp, artificial finality. Clara moved then, her steps economical and measured. She did not ascend the dais. She stood at the base of the wooden structure, looking up at the man who had stolen her inheritance. She did not shout. She did not plead for the crowd's sympathy. She spoke in a level, authoritative tone that cut through Thorne's bluster like a surveyor's line. She did not discuss her poverty or her father's debts. She discussed the Northern allotment. She spoke of the absolute inheritance laws of 1792 and the specific geometric boundaries that Thorne surreptitiously erased from the modern maps. She produced a single, fibrous parchment, the hand-drawn foundation schematic she had recovered from the library's hidden compartment. The schematic was not a map, it was a weapon of architectural truth. Clara unfurled the vellum, the amber light of the rising sun, catching the precise, elegant script of her father. She pointed to the notations that corresponded with the county land registry Julian Vane had helped her audit. She explained, with a mathematical certainty that silenced the square, how the acreage Thorne had used for his private collateral did not legally exist within the deeds he claimed to own. She spoke of the tax filing obfuscations, the rounding down of property lines, and the felony of the redirected easements. Each word was a calculated strike, an audit of a crime that had been hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. The crowd shifted, a low, rhythmic murmur rising from the villagers as they began to understand the scale of the deception. They looked at Silas Thorne, and then at the girl who had restored the Cursed Manor with her own hands. Thorne's face turned the color of jaundiced parchment, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He clutched the blackwood ledger to his chest, his knuckles white against the dark leather. He shouted that the schematic was a forgery, a child's drawing meant to confuse the law. He demanded that Arthur Miller sign the eviction, his silver cane shaking with the tremor of a collapsing ego. It was Lord Julian Vane, who stepped forward from the shadows of the square, his presence a calm, grey finality. He did not look at Thorne, he looked at the blackwood ledger. He spoke of the audit he had performed on the town's land registry and the discrepancies he had found in the tax records Thorne had submitted over the last 10 years. He informed the council that the ledger Thorne held was indeed the original, but that its contents, when compared to the foundation schematic and the 1792 deed, proved that the transfer of Ashford Park itself was predicated on a fraudulent valuation. The town square became a cathedral of frozen tension. The Blackwood Ledger was not a book of ownership, Clara said, her voice echoing with a quiet, expansive power. It was a contract of stewardship that you broke, Silas. You did not account for the architecture of the truth. The reckoning was swift and devoid of the melodrama Thorne had expected. Arthur Miller did not sign the eviction notice. He took the parchment and tore it in half, the sound a crisp, decisive end to the council's involvement. The members of the board stepped away from Thorne, their faces masks of bureaucratic distance. They recognized the shift in power the moment the insolvent girl became the most dangerous person in the valley. Thorne stood alone on the dais, his silver-topped cane appearing like a pathetic stick against the weight of the evidence. He was not defeated by a mob, he was dismantled by a ledger. As the sheriff stepped forward to take the Blackwood Ledger from Thorne's trembling hands, the town square felt a sudden, sharp release of pressure. The curse of Ashcomb Manor was finally defined not as a haunting, but as a theft. The shocking truth was not found in a bag of gold, but in the meticulous restoration of a name that had been buried in the dust. Silas Thorne was led away, his boots scuffing the stones he had once walked with such arrogance, his silver cane left behind on the wooden dais like a discarded relic. Clara did not watch him go. She was too busy counting the faces of the villagers who were now looking at her with a profound, earned respect. 3 months later, the air in the valley tasted of spring and damp earth, a scent of renewal that matched the transformation of Ashcomb Manor. The grand reopening was not a celebration of luxury, but a testament to stewardship. The manor stood against the greening hills, its stone walls no longer a grey carcass, but a solid, glowing fortress of integrity. The roof was a perfect geometry of Westmoreland slates, and the gardens were a disciplined arrangement of emerging life. The Cursed Manor had become the heart of the county, its pulse measured by the rhythmic ticking of the restored grandfather clock in the hall. Clara Ashford stood beneath the grand chandelier in the entrance hall, her spine straight, her hands clean and steady. The chandelier was not a literal thing. It was a kingdom of light, its hundreds of crystals catching the afternoon sun and throwing 1,000 tiny stars across the polished flagstones. She registered no weariness from the labor. She felt the quiet, ordered peace of a mind that had finally balanced the accounts. Martha Halloway moved through the rooms with a new, authoritative dignity, her bombazine skirts rustling with the pride of a woman who had seen the house return to its soul. Lord Julian Vane stood by the open doors, his observant grey eyes softened by a warmth that was no longer distant. He did not speak of love or romance. He spoke of the spring planting and the management of the northern quarries. He looked at Clara, seeing her not as a ward to be protected, but as a partner whose competence was the foundation of his own respect. They stood together in the silence of a house that was no longer empty. It was a silence of presence, of a home that had been earned through the private art of survival. Clara reached into her reticule and pulled out the original £15, now polished and resting in a small velvet pouch. She did not see them as the pittance. She saw them as the catalyst of her sovereignty. She placed the old metal case on the sycamore table, the metal smooth and dependable under her touch. The ledger of her new home was finally in perfect balance. She was 18, she was no longer homeless, and she had built a world where she could never be invisible again. Justice, she realized, was not a miracle. It was a slow-growing crop that required a patient gardener. The final entry in her personal ledger was not a record of debt or inheritance, it was a promise of permanence. As the sun set over the valley, casting long, golden shadows across the manor's threshold, Clara Ashford stepped out onto the porch. She did not look back at the ruin she had bought. She looked forward at the legacy she had built. The air was still, the house was warm, and the architecture of her life was at last complete. True dignity was not found in the blood of ancestors, but in the calluses of the hands and the clarity of a mind that knew how to count the cost of its own soul. She was the Lady of Ashcomb, and the manor was, finally, home.